The heavy silence inside the U.S. military tribunal chamber in Washington, D.C. carried the weight of history itself. Every officer, soldier, and civilian official present knew that this was not merely another trial, not just another legal proceeding, but the final reckoning of a man who had once been entrusted with immense power and who had used it not to protect but to exploit, not to lead but to corrupt, not to serve his soldiers but to destroy them. Colonel Mike Donovan sat rigidly at the defendant's table, his uniform stripped of its former luster, his shoulders hunched in a posture that betrayed the storm brewing inside him. The faces surrounding him were implacable, generals with years of service etched into their expressions, young officers whose futures had been jeopardized by his actions, and a panel of judges carrying the solemn responsibility of delivering justice on behalf of an entire nation. When the presiding officer rose, his voice carried across the room like the strike of a gavel itself. It was steady, deliberate, and unforgiving. He began by reminding everyone of the sacred duty every man and woman in uniform carried: the oath to protect the United States, to safeguard its people, to preserve the dignity of the armed forces. He spoke of honor, of sacrifice, of loyalty to comrades in arms, and then he contrasted those ideals with the actions of the man before him. Donovan, he declared, had abandoned those principles the moment he chose personal enrichment over responsibility, the moment he wielded his authority not to shield but to exploit, the moment he placed his greed above the safety and lives of those under his command. The presiding officer's words carved through the chamber like cold steel, striking deep into the hearts of those who listened. Many had suffered under Donovan's reign at Fort Liberty Division in Alaska, many had seen their trust in leadership shattered, and many had borne silent witness to acts of cruelty, corruption, and betrayal that ate away at the very core of the division. The officer paused, his gaze sweeping across the hall, lingering briefly on the rows of young soldiers who had come to hear the verdict. "The only just punishment for such betrayal," he said, his voice resonant with gravity, "is the one that restores damaged trust, protects the honor of our military, and affirms to every decent serviceman and woman that the integrity of our armed forces will not be compromised." A suffocating stillness followed. Then the presiding officer, with unflinching resolve, pronounced the final judgment. "Colonel Michael Donovan, this tribunal finds you guilty of gross dereliction of duty, abuse of authority, corruption, and reckless endangerment of your subordinates. Considering the severity of your crimes, your complete lack of remorse, and the irreparable damage you have inflicted upon national security, this court sentences you to the maximum penalty under military law. You are hereby stripped of your rank, dishonorably discharged from the United States Army, reduced to the lowest rank of private, and condemned to 20 years of federal imprisonment." The words echoed through the chamber with the force of a thunderclap. In that instant, Donovan's composure collapsed. His shoulders slumped as if the very weight of the sentence crushed his spine. His eyes, once filled with defiance, glazed over as though staring into a void. He did not hear the murmurs rippling through the room, nor the gavel striking again to affirm the verdict. All he heard, inside the wreckage of his mind, was the hollow ring of finality, the sound of a once brilliant career, a once powerful life, shattering irretrievably. Court officers moved to his side, lifting him by the arms as his legs buckled beneath him. He stumbled like a sleepwalker, his gaze vacant, his lips moving soundlessly as if speaking to phantoms of a past now forever lost. The proud fortress he had built around himself, the fortress of fear, of corruption, of coercion, was reduced to dust in a single moment of judgment. As he was led away, the chamber seemed to exhale at last, releasing years of tension in a wave of heavy but liberating silence. Justice had been done. The poison that had festered inside Fort Liberty Division was finally confronted, and the reckoning of Donovan marked the end of an era of fear. Yet amid the stern relief, the faces of many carried another expression: grief, for the wasted lives, for the trust destroyed, for the years that would never be reclaimed. Among those watching from the gallery was Major General Anna Morgan. Her figure was calm, composed, her eyes unwavering as they followed Donovan's broken form being escorted from the chamber. She had fought tirelessly to bring this day to pass, to tear away the veil of lies, to confront the rot that had eaten into the heart of her division. But she knew, even as the echoes of the verdict still lingered in the air, that her mission was not finished. This was only the first step. For the soldiers who had endured humiliation, for the officers who had remained silent under pressure, for the integrity of the division itself, the work of rebuilding was only beginning. Donovan had fallen, but the scars he left behind were deep, and scars did not fade overnight. The tribunal adjourned, and the chamber emptied slowly, the murmur of voices carrying a mix of solemn relief and quiet determination. Donovan was gone, his fate sealed, his name destined to be remembered not with honor but with infamy. But for the men and women of Fort Liberty Division, a new page was waiting to be written. The long winter of fear and corruption was over. And though dawn had not yet broken, the first light of a new era shimmered faintly on the horizon. The echo of the gavel had barely faded when Colonel Michael Donovan was lifted from his seat and led away, his body limp, his spirit crushed, his once commanding presence reduced to the fragile shell of a man stripped of everything that had once defined him. The chamber watched as the disgraced officer stumbled forward, guided by the firm hands of military police, his vacant eyes staring into nothingness, his lips trembling with words unheard by anyone but himself. He had spent years weaving a kingdom of fear, a fortress of lies and cruelty, a poisonous dominion where obedience was extracted not through respect but through intimidation, not through honor but through dread. Now, with a single verdict, that kingdom had crumbled into dust. As the heavy doors closed behind him, the suffocating aura that had long hung over the Fort Liberty Division seemed to dissolve. The tribunal hall, though still heavy with the weight of what had just transpired, breathed with a new air of release, as though a toxin had finally been purged. Those who had endured Donovan's reign, the young privates forced to carry out senseless punishments, the officers coerced into silence by fear of retaliation, the families who had seen their sons and daughters broken by unjust treatment felt a shift deep within themselves. For years, whispers of despair had haunted the barracks, shadows of mistrust had lingered over every conversation, and the very spirit of camaraderie that formed the lifeblood of the military had been poisoned. Now, with Donovan condemned, the spell was broken. Soldiers left the tribunal hall in silence at first, but beneath their solemn expressions a quiet current stirred, like the first thaw after a brutal winter. They could feel that the fortress of intimidation was gone, its architect cast down, its venom neutralized. Donovan's so-called loyalists, those who had thrived in the shadows, who had fattened themselves on corruption, who had wielded his authority to settle personal scores, were no longer untouchable. The net was closing around them, their own day of reckoning drawing near. The poisonous whispering that had once dictated life in the division would be silenced, not by more fear, but by justice. Back at Fort Liberty, the change became tangible. The soldiers who had walked with slouched shoulders and weary eyes began to stand taller. The barracks, once heavy with an invisible fog of dread, began to echo with sounds not heard for years, laughter, conversations about home, stories of loved ones, and even the simple chatter of men and women planning for weekends of rest or sharing dreams of what might await them once their service was over. No longer were their words censored by fear of eavesdropping, no longer did their thoughts twist under the suspicion that a careless phrase could bring retribution. The era of hushed voices and anxious glances had ended with Donovan's fall. Officers, too, felt the shift. Those who had suffered in silence, who had watched Donovan's corruption spread but dared not speak, now faced themselves in the mirror with a heavy but liberating burden. They knew that silence had been its own kind of complicity, and many carried guilt for not having acted sooner, for not having resisted the tide. Yet this guilt, sharp and painful, was also transforming into resolve. They began to ask themselves what it meant to lead, what it meant to wear the uniform with honor, and for the first time in years, they felt free to answer honestly. The culture of blind obedience, of unquestioning submission to an unjust superior, was evaporating like morning mist under the sun. In its place, the beginnings of something healthier took root, a culture where voices could be raised without fear, where questions could be asked, where the measure of a leader was not his ability to instill terror but his ability to inspire trust. Donovan's fall sent ripples far beyond the tribunal chamber. Families back home, who had written desperate letters about mistreatment and corruption but had never been answered, now received news that justice had prevailed. Parents felt relief that their children would no longer serve under a tyrant, wives, and husbands allowed themselves to hope that their loved ones' burdens might lighten, and children who had grown weary of the army's name began to see it once again as something honorable. Within the division itself, the physical atmosphere mirrored the change of spirit. The oppressive silence that once weighed on every corridor gave way to sounds of music playing softly from radios, the clatter of boots on parade grounds carried a new rhythm, and the dining halls rang with conversations that were no longer guarded. The barracks, once dens of whispered complaints and suppressed frustration, now felt alive with genuine human connection. For the first time in years, soldiers spoke openly about the things that truly mattered, their families, their hopes for the future, even the small joys of everyday life. They no longer measured each word against the possibility of reprisal, they no longer feared that Donovan's enforcers lurked around every corner. The collapse of Donovan's poisonous kingdom was not just the removal of one man, it was the end of a culture that had choked the life out of the division. It was as though an invisible chain had been broken, releasing everyone from its grip. Yet the scars remained. No one could erase the years of humiliation, the wasted time, the broken trust. Memories of senseless punishments, of seeing comrades demeaned, of nights spent wondering whether they would ever escape the cycle of abuse, these did not vanish with a verdict. They lingered in the minds of those who had lived through it, a reminder of how fragile the balance between leadership and tyranny could be. But even scars can become sources of strength, and already those wounds were knitting into a deeper resolve. Never again would they allow such corruption to take root. The division was not yet healed, but it had been freed. The poisonous rain had ended, the viper's nest destroyed, and in its place new seeds of trust and solidarity began to sprout. Major General Anna Morgan, watching quietly as these changes unfolded, knew better than anyone that the work was just beginning. The tribunal had toppled Donovan, but the shadow he had cast was long. She understood that the division would need time, discipline, and above all leadership rooted not in fear but in respect, to truly recover. Yet as she walked the grounds of Fort Liberty and saw the soldiers lifting their heads, saw them laugh again, saw them find comfort in each other's company, she felt the stirrings of something she had long fought to restore, hope. The collapse of Donovan's dark empire was not merely an ending. It was the fragile dawn of a new beginning. The weeks following Colonel Michael Donovan's removal from power unfolded like the slow lifting of a storm that had hung over Fort Liberty Division for years. At first, the changes were subtle, almost imperceptible to an outsider, but for those who had lived through the suffocating weight of his reign, each small shift felt monumental. Soldiers who had once marched with their eyes fixed on the ground began to lift their heads. Their footsteps, once heavy with resignation, found a rhythm again. The barracks, long shrouded in an atmosphere of dread, began to echo with voices that carried not fear but life. In the dining halls, conversations no longer died out when an officer entered. The silence that had been the default state of the division was replaced with something vibrant, something real. Soldiers spoke openly about their families, about the vacations they hoped to take, about the small dreams they had tucked away when every day felt like a battle for dignity. The fear of casual cruelty had evaporated. No longer did they dread being singled out for punishment that served no purpose but to feed Donovan's appetite for control. Instead, they felt the stirrings of trust, the faint but unmistakable awareness that they were once again part of something larger than themselves, something that valued their humanity as much as their discipline. The transformation spread slowly at first, like a cautious fire taking hold in damp wood, but soon it burned with undeniable force. The dark shadows that had clung to their faces seemed to dissipate, replaced by expressions of confidence, even joy. It was not the joy of careless youth but the hard-earned relief of men and women who had survived a long winter and now felt the sun on their skin again. Laughter returned to Fort Liberty, not the nervous laughter of those trying to mask fear, but the genuine laughter of camaraderie. Stories were told in bunks at night without the paranoid glances to see if someone was listening. Young privates who once spoke in whispers now argued loudly over sports, shared music, or teased one another without worry of reprisal. In the training fields, the atmosphere was no longer one of dread but of determination. Soldiers trained hard, yes, but they trained with purpose, pushing themselves because they wanted to, not because they feared the lash of an angry superior. There was a new sense of pride growing, the kind of pride that cannot be forced by threats but only nurtured by respect. Officers, too, began to find their footing in this new world. For years they had been trapped in a paralyzing dilemma: obey Donovan's corrupt directives or risk their careers, their reputations, even their safety. Now, with the Viper dethroned, they discovered that their voices carried weight again. Meetings no longer echoed with hollow affirmations but with real debate. Ideas were shared freely, plans scrutinized honestly, and decisions made not to appease a tyrant but to serve the men and women under their command. The younger officers, in particular, felt an awakening. Many of them had joined the army with ideals of honor and duty, only to find themselves suffocating under Donovan's regime. Now, for the first time, they felt they could live up to those ideals. They could lead not as enforcers of fear but as mentors, as protectors, as fellow soldiers walking the same difficult path. Among the rank and file, the change was most visible in their eyes. Where once there had been a dullness, the lifeless stare of men and women resigned to endure whatever came, there was now a light. It was fragile, flickering at times, but undeniable. They looked at each other differently too, no longer as victims huddled together under a storm, but as comrades who had survived something terrible and were stronger for it. Even the smallest details carried weight. A private daring to pin a family photo to the wall without worrying it might be torn down. A group of soldiers singing softly during downtime without fear of being silenced. Letters home written with words of hope instead of despair. These were the signs of rebirth, of a division rediscovering its soul. Yet it was not only relief that filled the air, there was also a new determination. Having lived through the darkness, the soldiers of Fort Liberty Division seemed to understand with a clarity forged in suffering that their unity, their trust in one another, was their most valuable weapon. No arsenal of advanced weapons could match the strength born of loyalty and respect. They began to watch out for each other in ways that went beyond duty. A hand offered when someone stumbled during a run, a word of encouragement whispered during grueling drills, a shared meal when supplies ran thin. These gestures, small as they seemed, built something monumental, a sense of family. For years they had been treated as tools, as expendable pieces in Donovan's machine of control. Now they began to believe they were brothers and sisters again, bound not by fear but by shared purpose. It was not lost on them that this transformation had been made possible by those who had stood up, who had dared to confront Donovan, who had dragged his corruption into the light. They spoke of Major General Anna Morgan with reverence, not as a distant superior but as a leader who had fought for them when they could not fight for themselves. Her name passed through the barracks with respect, not imposed from above but offered freely from below. For the first time, soldiers began to believe in leadership again. Hope, however, is a fragile thing, and it needed to be protected. The scars of Donovan's rule had not vanished. Nightmares still haunted some. Anger and guilt still gnawed at others. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. But there was progress, undeniable progress, and with each passing day the weight grew lighter, the shadows retreated further, and the future seemed less like a sentence and more like a possibility. The soldiers of Fort Liberty Division, who had once carried despair like a second skin, now carried something new on their shoulders, the belief that tomorrow could be better. In the end, the change could be summed up in one simple truth: they no longer saw themselves as objects to be controlled, but as comrades to be respected. That single shift was enough to transform everything. The fear that had silenced them was gone, and in its place bloomed voices, laughter, and dreams. The long winter had ended. Spring had come to Fort Liberty. The reckoning did not end with Colonel Michael Donovan's conviction, for a kingdom of corruption does not vanish simply because its ruler has fallen. At Fort Liberty Division, in the cold expanse of Alaska, the shadow he cast had stretched into every corridor, every office, every chain of command, and the process of cleansing that poison was only beginning. Investigators moved swiftly, peeling back the layers of deceit that Donovan had so carefully woven. Files long buried were unearthed, accounts scrutinized, testimonies gathered from men and women who had lived too long under the threat of retaliation. The web of complicity was wide. There were officers who had benefited directly from Donovan's schemes, those who had accepted favors, turned blind eyes, or even orchestrated acts of cruelty on his behalf. They had paraded as loyal lieutenants, cloaking themselves in his protection, feeding off the privileges that came from serving a corrupt master. These men and women found no shield in Donovan's downfall. They were called before tribunals of their own, stripped of rank, and dismissed in disgrace. Some were prosecuted for crimes as grave as embezzlement and abuse of authority. Others, though spared prison, bore the indelible mark of dishonor, their names whispered with contempt among the ranks they had once commanded. For those who had profited from corruption, the reckoning was sharp and merciless. Yet there was another group, perhaps even more numerous, whose complicity had been silence. They were the officers who had seen what Donovan was doing, who had recognized the rot spreading through the division, but who had said nothing. Fear, ambition, or simple resignation had sealed their lips. They told themselves that survival demanded obedience, that to speak out was to invite ruin, that one voice against Donovan's power was meaningless. And so they endured, waiting, hoping that the storm would pass. Now, in the aftermath, these officers faced a different kind of judgment, not from the tribunal, but from within their own souls. They carried guilt heavy as lead. They asked themselves, night after night, why they had not stood sooner, why they had allowed cruelty to reign unchecked, why they had permitted good soldiers to suffer while they remained silent. It was a quiet torment, sharper than any official punishment, and yet it became, paradoxically, the seed of renewal. From that guilt grew a determination never to be silent again, never to let obedience outweigh conscience, never to allow fear to eclipse duty. They began to speak, haltingly at first, then with growing confidence. Meetings once stifled by ritual affirmations became forums of real debate. Voices rose to challenge ideas, to question strategies, to propose alternatives. Disagreement was no longer a sign of disloyalty but of engagement, and through the clash of ideas stronger solutions were born. The culture of blind submission, once the very lifeblood of Donovan's rule, began to wither. In its place grew a fragile but vital culture of responsibility. Leaders understood that authority was not a weapon to wield but a trust to uphold. Subordinates realized that their voices mattered, that they could speak truth without fear of reprisal. It was a revolution not of gunfire or banners but of thought, of trust, of dialogue. Change echoed in the smallest of details. In strategy rooms, junior officers dared to point out flaws in senior plans without dread of being crushed for insolence. In training grounds, sergeants encouraged feedback from the soldiers they drilled, not as weakness but as a means of improving together. In barracks, whispers of gossip and despair gave way to open discussions about goals, about problems, about solutions. The division, once paralyzed by fear, had begun to breathe with a rhythm of honesty. Those who resisted this new order, remnants of Donovan's mindset, found themselves isolated. Their authority, once drawn from intimidation, now rang hollow. Soldiers no longer flinched at their barked commands, instead, they measured leaders by fairness, by competence, by integrity. The corrupt could not survive in this climate, for corruption thrives in silence, and silence was no longer the language of Fort Liberty. Major General Anna Morgan watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and gravity. She knew that cultural change was the hardest battle of all, more difficult even than uprooting Donovan himself. Policies could be rewritten, corrupt officers dismissed, equipment upgraded, but to change the way men and women thought, to erase years of fear and replace it with confidence, that required patience, persistence, and faith. She walked the corridors of the division not as a distant authority figure but as a visible presence. She listened to soldiers' concerns, encouraged their questions, and treated their voices with the respect once denied them. Slowly, the example spread. Other officers, seeing her willingness to listen, began to emulate it. The very structure of leadership shifted, becoming less a pyramid of decrees and more a circle of responsibility. This was not anarchy. Discipline still held firm, as it must in any military force. Orders were given and followed, but they were given with explanation, with purpose, with respect, and in return they were followed not out of fear but out of conviction. The rebirth of Fort Liberty Division was not instantaneous. There were setbacks, there were missteps, there were moments when old habits resurfaced. But the trajectory was undeniable. The division was cleansing itself not only of Donovan's cronies but of Donovan's spirit. The venom that had poisoned its veins was being purged, replaced by the fresh blood of trust and accountability. Those who had once been silent now found in their guilt a source of strength, a reminder of what must never be repeated. Those who had once exploited power found themselves exiled, their names erased from the honor rolls. And those who remained began to understand that true strength lay not in domination but in unity, not in fear but in respect. The cleansing of Fort Liberty Division was not just a process of punishment, it was a process of rebirth. It was the forging of a new identity, one that would be tested in battles yet to come but which would endure because it was built on a foundation stronger than fear, the foundation of trust. Major General Anna Morgan understood from the very moment Donovan's sentence was handed down that tearing away the rot was only half of her mission. The other half, the harder half, lay in rebuilding what had been lost, in breathing life back into a division that had been hollowed out by years of corruption and neglect. She could not be content with removing poison from the system, she had to restore vitality, restore strength, restore honor. Fort Liberty Division had once been spoken of with pride, its legacy tied to the frozen frontiers of Alaska, where resilience and discipline were as essential as air. Under Donovan it had been reduced to a shell of its former self, soldiers stripped not only of resources but of dignity, their days filled with meaningless drills, their nights consumed by despair. Equipment had been left to rust, training had devolved into pageantry for Donovan's ego, and morale had sunk to depths more dangerous than any enemy force. Morgan knew that an army's spirit could not be commanded into existence, it had to be cultivated. And so she set about her work with relentless focus. She began with training, for training was the heartbeat of any fighting force. Gone were the hollow parades staged to impress superiors, gone were the endless routines that served no purpose beyond displaying control. In their place, Morgan introduced rigorous field exercises that mirrored the chaos and unpredictability of real combat. Soldiers found themselves maneuvering through frozen forests, trudging across snow-covered plains, and simulating live combat scenarios that tested not just endurance but decision-making under fire. It was grueling, unforgiving, and at times overwhelming, but it was real, and for the first time in years the soldiers felt they were preparing for the mission they had sworn to uphold, to defend their nation with skill and resolve. The change was not easy. Bodies ached, tempers flared, mistakes were made. But through sweat and struggle the soldiers began to rediscover something that had been stolen from them, pride in their craft. Each obstacle overcome, each exercise completed, forged bonds of trust and confidence. They were no longer cogs in Donovan's machine, they were warriors again, and they could feel it in their bones. Morgan did not stop at training. She turned her attention to the tools her soldiers carried, for she knew that respect for her men and women demanded more than words, it demanded action. She fought fiercely with Washington for resources, demanding replacements for defective equipment, pushing for modern gear that matched the standards of any elite unit. Trucks that had long broken down were replaced, radios that once sputtered with static were upgraded, weapons that jammed in the cold were swapped for models tested against the harshest Alaskan winters. Uniforms arrived in crates, not the worn-out rags Donovan had forced his soldiers to wear, but new, warm, durable fabrics that shielded them from the elements. To outsiders it might have seemed trivial: new boots, new jackets, new packs, but to the soldiers it was a declaration: you matter, your safety matters, your work matters. Each item of equipment carried with it a promise that they were no longer forgotten, no longer disposable. With new training and new tools came a shift in mindset. The division began to move with a confidence that had been absent for years. Marches were no longer trudges of resignation but strides of purpose. The parade ground, once a stage for Donovan's vanity, became the site of fierce drills where precision and discipline were matched with passion and commitment. The barracks, once silent with despair, now buzzed with conversations about tactics, about exercises, about the lessons learned in the field. Soldiers compared bruises and blisters like badges of honor, sharing stories of exhaustion that turned into laughter. Pain was no longer humiliation, it was proof of progress. Morgan knew the value of presence, and she made herself visible in every corner of the division. She did not command from a distance, locked away in an office. She walked among her soldiers, watching their drills, inspecting their gear, listening to their frustrations. When mistakes were made, she corrected them firmly but with fairness. When achievements were earned, she acknowledged them not with hollow ceremony but with genuine recognition. She spoke to her soldiers not as an untouchable figure but as a leader who shared their burdens, who understood their trials, who believed in their worth. Her words carried weight because they were matched by action. When she promised better equipment, it arrived. When she demanded harder training, she endured the same freezing winds alongside them. When she called them a family, she proved it in the way she defended their dignity. This authenticity became the cornerstone of her leadership. Slowly but surely, the Fort Liberty Division began to resemble the fighting force it had once been, but stronger, because this time its strength was not built on fear but on trust. Instructors reported a level of engagement they had not seen in years. Recruits who once dreaded joining the division now arrived with eagerness, drawn by the reputation of a commander who cared for her people. Veterans who had considered retiring in disgust chose to stay, unwilling to walk away from the rebirth they had fought so hard to see. The transformation did not go unnoticed beyond the icy borders of Alaska. Reports reached Washington of a division once deemed broken now rising again, its morale restored, its combat readiness climbing with every month. What had been written off as a casualty of Donovan's corruption was being reborn under Morgan's watchful eye, and for the first time in a long time the name Fort Liberty carried pride instead of shame. Yet Morgan knew the work was never truly done. Rebuilding was not a single act but a continuous process, and every day brought new challenges, the lingering doubts of soldiers still haunted by the past, the logistical battles with bureaucrats who saw numbers instead of people, the endless grind of drills in a landscape that tested human limits. But she also knew that every obstacle overcome strengthened not only the division but the bond between leader and soldier, between comrade and comrade. She was not merely restoring a unit, she was forging a family. And in that family lay the true essence of strength, the kind that could withstand any storm. In the frozen winds of Alaska, beneath the unforgiving skies, Fort Liberty Division was rising from its ashes. And at its heart stood Major General Anna Morgan, not as a distant symbol but as the living embodiment of the principle that had guided her from the beginning: an army's true power lies not in weapons or fear, but in the trust and respect of those who march together. The day dawned crisp and clear, the kind of autumn morning that seemed carved from glass, sharp and brilliant beneath the wide Alaskan sky. A thin mist hung over Liberty Parade ground, curling around the rows of soldiers as they assembled, boots striking against the frozen earth with a rhythm that carried both anticipation and reverence. For weeks they had trained, rebuilt, and healed under Major General Anna Morgan's direction, but now came the moment that would cement the division's rebirth, a moment that would be remembered not just as ceremony but as the birth of a new era. Word had spread across the base, through the barracks and the mess halls, into the very marrow of every soldier's being. Today, Anna Morgan would formally assume command of Fort Liberty Division, and in doing so, she would etch her place in history as the first woman to lead this storied force. The soldiers lined the courtyard with precision, their uniforms sharp, their equipment polished to gleam against the sunlight. Yet behind the formality was something rawer, something deeper, an energy that buzzed in the air, a sense of pride that could not be faked. Where once their eyes had been dulled by despair, now they shone with expectation, with belief. They stood not out of fear of reprimand but out of respect, out of the knowledge that they were about to witness the culmination of everything they had endured. The stage was set at the head of the parade ground, draped with the flag of the United States and the proud insignia of Fort Liberty Division. Behind it, the aging figure of General Richard "Rick" Sloan stood in uniform, his posture straight though his face carried the lines of time and regret. He had carried the weight of command during Donovan's treachery, his health faltering under the burden of responsibility and guilt. But now, with honor, he was prepared to step aside, not in disgrace but in humility, acknowledging that the division's future required new strength, new vision, and a leader forged not in politics but in integrity. Soldiers whispered his name with respect, for though he had faltered, he had returned to bear responsibility and had chosen to pass the torch with dignity. The murmur of voices faded as the ceremony began. The national anthem rose into the cold air, carried by a brass band that seemed to pour the weight of history into every note. Rows of soldiers snapped to attention, the ground trembling faintly beneath the unified stomp of boots. Then the announcer's voice rang clear, introducing the transfer of command. General Sloan stepped forward, his voice measured, heavy with both solemnity and release. He spoke of the division's past, of the trials it had endured, of the mistakes made and the lessons learned. He did not hide his own failures, for to do so would have been dishonest. Instead, he acknowledged them openly, offering not excuses but a vow that he had sought redemption through accountability. And finally, with a steady hand, he declared his retirement, passing the command not into the void but into hands that had already proven themselves in fire. The moment came as Anna Morgan stepped onto the platform. She did not need fanfare, her presence was enough. The soldiers' eyes followed her, their breaths held as if the weight of the world hung on the words she had yet to speak. She stood tall, her uniform immaculate, her expression calm yet filled with something unshakably human. She looked not like a distant icon but like a leader who carried both strength and empathy, forged from the same steel as those who stood before her. When she began to speak, her voice was not booming, not wrapped in theatrics, but clear, steady, and utterly sincere. Today, she said, letting the silence of the parade ground carry her words into every ear, I will not promise you an army that will always win. I will not stand here and pretend that victory is inevitable, or that challenges will vanish. What I promise you instead is something more real, something more enduring. I promise to build an army that is a family, an army where no soldier stands alone, where in the darkest moment you will find a hand to lift you, a comrade to guard your back, and a commander who will fight for your dignity. Her gaze moved across the sea of faces, and the soldiers felt as if she were speaking to each of them individually. Strength, she continued, is not born from the sharpest weapon or the finest strategy. True strength comes from trust in one another, trust in the mission, trust that we are more than a collection of individuals. We are a family, bound not by fear, but by pride in our country and in each other. We are not gathered here to trample others underfoot, but to protect our homeland, our people, and the comrades who march beside us. That is our mission, and we will never forget it. The words struck like lightning, not because they were lofty or poetic, but because they were true. The soldiers had lived the alternative, an army ruled by fear, hollowed by corruption, suffocated by lies. Now they were being offered something else, an army bound by loyalty, by respect, by genuine purpose. They felt it ignite within them, a flame that spread from soldier to soldier, officer to officer, until the entire division pulsed with the energy of renewal. When her speech ended, there was a silence, brief but profound, as if the air itself had paused to absorb her words. Then came the sound, rising like a storm, applause, cheers, the thunder of boots striking the ground not in formality but in jubilation. It was not the polite clapping of a forced audience, it was the roar of souls unshackled, of hearts awakened. The sound echoed across the parade ground, across the base, into the frozen wilderness beyond, as if the very land bore witness to the rebirth of Fort Liberty Division. Anna Morgan stood for a moment, letting the wave wash over her, not basking in it but absorbing its meaning. This was not adoration for her alone, it was the collective voice of a division that had been broken and was now whole again. She gave a final nod, a small gesture that carried the weight of a promise. She had spoken as their commander, but she would lead as their comrade. Beside her, General Sloan watched, his eyes reflecting both sorrow and peace. He knew his time had passed, but he also knew he had passed the torch to hands worthy of it. For him, there was honor in this moment, a redemption earned not through victory but through humility. As the ceremony concluded, the soldiers remained electrified, their conversations buzzing with hope, their posture infused with pride. Liberty Parade Ground had seen many ceremonies before, but none like this. None had carried with them the sense that history itself had shifted, that a new chapter had been written in blood, in sacrifice, in resilience. And above them, the Alaskan sky stretched wide and endless, the autumn sun blazing brighter than it had in years, as if to herald not just the rise of a new commander, but the dawn of a new era. As the echoes of applause still lingered across Liberty Parade ground and the ceremony slowly dissolved into a quiet hum of conversation and movement, Anna Morgan stepped down from the platform with measured grace, her boots striking against the stone in steady rhythm, her mind heavy not with pride but with the weight of responsibility that now rested fully on her shoulders. She had spoken the words, she had accepted the command, but she knew that speeches alone did not transform armies. Only actions, lived day by day, sacrifice by sacrifice, would carve the legacy of this moment into permanence. Around her the soldiers dispersed into their ranks, their eyes still bright, their spirits lifted, and yet she sensed that what had just been born on this ground needed to be nurtured, guarded, and proven. For as much as the ceremony had marked the end of Donovan's reign and the close of Sloane's tenure, it was the beginning of a journey that demanded vigilance and unshakable faith. She paused near the edge of the parade ground, the crisp autumn air brushing against her face, when a figure approached with precise steps, his posture rigid, his eyes locked forward with a determination that spoke volumes before his voice was ever heard. Lieutenant Paul O'Connor, once the young officer who had lived under the shadow of Donovan's tyranny, once the man whose eyes had been dulled by despair and fear, now stood before her with a presence transformed. His salute was sharp, his uniform crisp, but more than that, his gaze carried something new, confidence, resolve, and a pride that could not be feigned. "Comrade Division Commander," he said, his tone steady, free from hesitation, each word carrying the weight of conviction, "allow me to speak. I will serve you faithfully and truly." There was no tremor in his voice, no shadow of doubt. He was not speaking merely as a subordinate fulfilling ritual but as a soldier pledging his very soul to a cause reborn. Anna Morgan met his eyes, and for a moment the world seemed to still around them. In that exchange she saw not just one man but the reflection of an entire division, of soldiers who had suffered, endured, and now stood ready to rebuild alongside her. She inclined her head with warmth that softened the formality of the moment, a smile flickering across her lips, not grand but deeply human. "I will count on you as well, Lieutenant," she replied, her voice carrying the strength of command but also the intimacy of trust. "And thank you." The gratitude was not ceremonial, it was genuine, born from her understanding that leaders could not shape the future alone. It was the loyalty of men like Paul O'Connor that turned vision into reality. His salute lingered a moment longer before he lowered his hand, and in his eyes she saw maturity, a readiness to lead others, to bear responsibility not as a burden but as an honor. He would not walk the path of fear that Donovan had forced upon him, he would lead with courage, with the same trust that she now offered him. In him she saw the seed of a future commander, a generation that would carry the division long after her own time had passed. As she turned her gaze back across Liberty Parade ground, she saw more than soldiers standing in formation, she saw a family forged from fire, a force that had been broken but not destroyed, scarred but not defeated. The darkness that had once hung over them had lifted, replaced by the light of purpose and the warmth of camaraderie. In the barracks, where once whispers of despair had echoed, there would now be laughter, conversations of future plans, dreams of homecomings, and ambitions of life beyond service. The fear that had poisoned their days was gone, replaced by a new sense of belonging. The officers, too, had changed. Those who had once been parasites feeding off Donovan's corruption were gone, held accountable, stripped of their false power. Those who had remained silent, complicit in their inaction, now wrestled with their consciences, but instead of dragging them into despair, that struggle had become fuel for change. They too had embraced a new way of leading, one rooted not in blind obedience to injustice but in rationality, dialogue, and the pursuit of the greater good. The culture of silence had shattered, in its place grew a culture of trust, where questions could be asked, where strategies could be debated, where solutions could be forged not by fear of rank but by the wisdom of collaboration. It was not a revolution of violence but of spirit, a transformation that would echo beyond the icy borders of Alaska into the very soul of the military. And at the heart of it stood Anna Morgan, not as a savior, not as a figure to be worshipped, but as a commander who had given her division back to its soldiers. She had not erased their scars, but she had taught them that scars could be symbols of survival, of resilience, of strength earned through suffering. Through her leadership, the division had been reborn, not in the illusion of perfection but in the authenticity of trust. Above them, the Alaskan sky stretched wide and boundless, the autumn sun pouring its light over Liberty Parade ground as if blessing this new beginning. The icy winds carried no longer the whispers of fear but the voices of men and women laughing, shouting, calling to one another with the ease of comrades. The ground that had once absorbed despair now trembled with the footsteps of soldiers who believed again. Fort Liberty Division, once drowning in shadows, now stood radiant, its heart beating strong, its spirit alive. It was not just a military unit, it was a symbol, a testament to the fact that even in the deepest darkness, renewal was possible. Lieutenant Paul O'Connor walked back to his place among the ranks, his head high, his chest steady with pride. Around him, other soldiers stood straighter, their shoulders squared, their eyes lifted not toward some abstract horizon but toward the living reality of their commander and their shared mission. They had been through hell together, and through that hell they had emerged not broken but unshakable. Anna Morgan lingered a moment longer before leaving the field, her footsteps slow, her eyes scanning the faces one last time. She did not see soldiers defined by rank or status, she saw a family, a living force of men and women bound by something that no decree could grant and no enemy could take away. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, that trials still waited, that battles yet unseen would test them. But she also knew, with an unshakable certainty, that they would face it together, stronger than before, stronger because they had chosen trust over fear, honor over corruption, hope over despair. And so, as the sun blazed higher, as the shadows shrank and the air filled with the vitality of rebirth, Fort Liberty Division stepped into its new era. The pain of the past had not been forgotten, the scars remained, but those scars had become the foundation of their strength. The infernal darkness had dissipated, and from its ashes rose a division brighter, firmer, and more united than ever. Above Liberty Parade ground, it seemed the very sky proclaimed the truth that every soldier now carried in their heart: they had endured, they had overcome, and they had been reborn.